Hello, and welcome to the second installment of the RMWB's Indigenous Speaker Series featuring Michelle Good. My name is Lauren Goloski. I'm an advisor with the Indigenous and Rural Relations Department, and I'm honored to be your host, and I'm especially honored and humbled to be bringing you this event today on the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. In the spirit of reconciliation and to express gratitude to all those that were here before us, to all those that are here with us now, and to the generations that will follow, we wish to acknowledge that the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo is, and the lands upon which we all live, learn, work, and play is Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of and home of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people, and the unceded territory of the Métis. We thank you for welcoming us and sharing your beautiful territory and traditional lands. Marcy Cho, hi hi. Before we begin, I'd like to disclose that this event is being recorded in its entirety. It will be available later for public viewing, so if you have friends or family that could not join us today, please let them know it will be available to watch in the coming days. Now, here's a message from Mayor Don Scott.
Tansi, Eglinate. I first want to recognize that we are in Treaty 8 and unceded Métis territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people. On behalf of the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo, I am honored to welcome you on this journey of learning, the second of our Indigenous Speaker Series. Today is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Established by the federal government in response to the Truth and Reconciliation of Canada's Calls to Action number 80. As such, this event is an opportunity to educate and remind us about the history of residential schools, honor survivors, those who did not survive, and their families. On this day and all other days, we must commit to learn, to listen, and to work in partnership as we move forward on the path of reconciliation. And while we cannot come together in person right now, we welcome this opportunity to listen and learn in a virtual way. Thank you. Hi, hi, Marcy Cho.
Thank you, Mayor Scott. Before we begin, a few additional housekeeping items I'd like to share.
Dear Creator, I call upon you to give me and all the other residential.
Sorry about that. Okay, a few additional housekeeping items. First, the content today will be heavy and potentially disturbing to some. Please be gentle with yourself. Your audio device will be muted for the presentation portion of this afternoon. Speakers can share that way without facing interruptions. If you have questions throughout our time together, please enter them at any time into the chat. And alternatively, you can text your questions to 780-838-3925. Like I said, we always prepare for these virtual events, but we do ask for your patience if and when we experience technical difficulties. One of the 7 sacred teachings emphasizes the importance of respect. In honoring this, we ask that everyone joins today and commits to being respectful in our interactions with one another. We want to create as safe a space as possible for discussion and learning. Disrespectful behavior cannot be tolerated and may result in removal from the meeting. Thank you, and let's begin. I'd now like to welcome McMurray Métis Elder Lori Gallagher to graciously start us with a prayer.
Dear Creator, I call upon you to give me and all the other residential school survivors the strength we need to get through today. Orange Shirt Day, September the 30th, 2021 marks the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We are wearing the orange shirts on this day to honor the survivors and the children who were so young and were taken away from their families that suffered and died during their stay in residential schools. Please give the survivors a long life filled with happiness. Please forgive those who have taken away our children. Please honor and remember that every child matters. Let us all join together and say the Lord's Prayer in memory of the children and honor of the survivors. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom and the power and the glory are yours, and now and forever. Amen. Aye, aye.
Thank you, Elder Lori. Thank you, Elder Lori. Now please join me in taking a moment of silence to honor the survivors of residential schools and the children who never made it home. Thank you. It is not a coincidence that this event is taking place on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day. It was a very intentional decision. The municipality wanted to offer an opportunity for people to come together to learn about and remind us all of the realities of residential schools, the legacy of residential schools, and the trauma and intergenerational trauma and how that all impacts Indigenous peoples today. It is also an opportunity to commemorate the inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, honor survivors, and the countless children who never made it home. I hope if you're wearing an orange shirt today, like me and many others, that you've taken the time to reflect on the symbolism of it and to think about the children like Kenny, Lucy, Clara, Howie, and Maisie, who experienced the unthinkable, being ripped away from their families, homes, and cultures and forced into residential schools. If those names aren't familiar to you, they will be soon. Those are the 5 central characters in Michelle Good's novel, 5 Little Indians. And yes, it's a book of fiction, but one based on real-life recollections of residential school experiences. Michelle Good is a Cree writer and a member of Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years, she obtained a law degree and advocated for residential school survivors for more than 14 years. Michelle earned a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia while still practicing law and managing her own law firm. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada. Her poetry was included on 2 lists of the best Canadian poetry in 2016 and 2017. 5 Little Indians is her first novel. It won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize, the Amazon First Novel Prize, the Governor General's Literary Award, and the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Award. It was also longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and a finalist for the Writers' Trust Award. We are so humbled and grateful to have Michelle join us this afternoon. Michelle Good, welcome to Wood Buffalo, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I hope that we have a really good conversation, and in particular on this inaugural day of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. sadly, not all of the provinces are recognizing this day, and I say shame on them, but many, many, many people are, and I'm so delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I will pass it over to you. Thank you.
To me?
Yeah.
So I guess, you know, one of the questions that people ask me an awful lot is, you know, why did I choose fiction and why did I write this book? And, you know, I have to respond by saying I was threatening to write this book for many, many years before I finally did. And it really was in response to that terrible and ubiquitous question that we're often faced with as we struggle to restore the strength and vibrancy of our Indigenous communities. And that is, why can't they just get over it? When people are either in articles or conversation, the subject of residential schools comes up and people, you know, just, you know, it's history. Why can't you just let it go? Why can't you just get over it? And so I wanted to create something that would be a visceral, meaningful response to that question. Here's why. But lately in my conversations with people about the book and about residential schools generally, one of the things that I one of the ways that I'm trying to respond to that is, what exactly is it that you're asking us to forget? What is it that you're asking us to get over? And in fact, you're asking us to get over 130 years of our children being removed from our communities, 130 years of children not making it home, 130 years of being subjected to a degree of brutality that is often hard to even conceive of. And in response to that, it's not unusual for people to respond by saying that they believe that it was a well-intentioned initiative and it just went terribly wrong. And, you know, I have to say I'm sorry, but that's just not the truth. And it's really, really important for people to understand that residential schools were a life and death experience for the children who were forced to attend. And, you know, first of all, we need to understand that they were, in fact, under the color of law, forced to attend these schools. It was not voluntary in any way.
And all other days, we must commit to learn.
Okay. We've got Trickster kicking around with us today here. So anyway, so now I've just sort of lost where I was at. It was a little bit shocking. So, well, yes, the whole question about, you know, this notion that this was a well-intentioned initiative. And, you know, one of the most important things that I think people can do on this day and on every day is to embark on a process of re-education, of educating yourselves, accepting responsibility for your education about true, real Canadian history. Right now in Edmonton, there's a conversation going on about changing the name of a street in Edmonton who is named after Bishop Vital Grandin, who was a Catholic bishop who was a very, very vocal supporter of the residential school initiative, if you will. And in 1875, he said, "We instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life, so they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood." And so there you have it, right there is, you know, this is the objective of the Catholic Church in cahoots with the federal government or the colonial government at the time, was to humiliate little children and to make them ashamed of who they were, what their cultures were, who their peoples were. That was in 1875. In a subsequent letter, he confirmed that the objective of the institutions was to ensure that the children forget the customs, habits, and language of their ancestors. But he was not alone in this. Sir John A. Macdonald in 1883, he wasn't yet the Prime Minister. In fact, he was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And he also was speaking out in support of the establishment and maintenance of residential schools. And he said, and all of this is, you can find all of this. You can even find it online. It's so easy to find this stuff. It wasn't 20 years ago. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thoughts of white men. This is in the House of Commons debates in May of 1883. And so, you know, it clearly was an intentional program to eliminate Indigenous people entirely. And when we hear this spring about the discovery of the over 200 graves, unmarked graves at the Kamloops First Nation in Kamloops, you know, I experienced that announcement with such mixed feelings, because we've known about it forever. We've known about it since the first child died at residential school. And there's official awareness of this as well. And it is, you know, there was a fellow whose name was, he was the chief medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs, Dr. Peter Bryce. And he was commissioned to undertake a study of the residential schools, of the conditions in the schools. He did. And when he came back, he told the Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs, he told him that if we had set out to create a mechanism for the successful transference of tuberculosis, we have done that with the residential schools. And he went on to say that even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as does the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. And it was just a few, you know, Scott's further response from that, or to that. First of all, he fired Dr. Bryce for his, you know, his ethical reporting of the truth. Bryce went on to write an extended essay for the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, which was entitled A National Crime. And there is subsequently John S. Malloy, a scholar from Saskatchewan, wrote a book called A National Crime, which is one of the best histories of the residential school legacy that you will find anywhere. And I highly recommend it to everybody. But Scott's response to the fact that these children were dying in the schools was this. He said, and this is a quote, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem." I note that a Canadian government official used the term final solution before Hitler did with respect to the Jewish Holocaust during the Second World War. He was also quoted, Scott that is, in an essay that he wrote. He says, "It's quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein." Now, of course, the education they received in there was how to be domestic servants and manual laborers, and how to obey their white overlord, so to speak. And so, you know, when I draw attention to the phraseology, you know, solving our Indian problem and the final solution, it's important to give this consideration in the context of after the Second World War, when the genocide conventions were developed first through the League of Nations and then its successor, the United Nations. There were 5 definitions of genocide that were created. The 5th of those was the removal of children from one group to another. There's no purpose indicated, not you know, the removal of children to destroy a culture, the removal of children to, you know, weaken communities, or none of that is added onto it. That is not modified. Genocide is the removal, or the removal of children from one group to another. So the residential school legacy is a genocidal legacy. I used to think that it was about assimilating, forcibly assimilating Indigenous people into Canadian non-Indigenous society. But I've since changed my mind. It was because if it had been assimilation, where was the support when the kids left the school? Where was the meaningful education? Where was anything in support of these kids finding a place in Canadian society? It just wasn't there, because that wasn't the goal. The goal was to eliminate us both from that direction and in terms of eliminating our ability to continue to live our mode of life as we had for time immemorial, and clearing us from the land so the resources could be exploited by the colonial government. And so when you start, when Scott was talking about 50% of the children dying at these schools, imagine that, and be aware that the almost, or just slightly over 6,000 graves that have been found now are just a tip of the iceberg. But one of the most frustrating things about all of this is that in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission created 6 calls to action under the heading Missing Children and Burial Sites. And those calls to action basically gave the federal government a roadmap of how to proceed with sorting out this issue of locating and repatriating these little kids home so that they could be properly taken care of according to their community and cultural protocols. They associated a budget of about $1.5 million to start with this. Prime Minister Harper was Prime Minister then, and he just said no. He just rejected the request. And basically nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing. Subsequently, until Indigenous peoples themselves took on the onerous task of looking for the remains of their forebears, looking for, you know, what could have been the generation of their parents or even their own generation. And it was only when Indigenous people could produce the bones, it's only when Indigenous people raised the skeletons or the specter of these skeletons of these little children that finally the government acknowledges the reality and the necessity of resolving this situation, and came forward for their photo opportunity and their big fat check. And that is unacceptable, and every Canadian should think of it as unacceptable. Indigenous people have carried the burden of educating non-Indigenous people for far too long, and it's time. There are so many resources that are available now, both in fiction, non-fiction, in the academy, courses you can take, conversations you can have. It's all so available now, like it never has been. And it's just simply unacceptable that when we are needed in our communities to contribute to the growth, healing, and well-being of our communities, that's where we should be putting our time. And non-Indigenous people should be shouldering the responsibility of their own re-education, if you will. And so Another thing that I also do is I ask people to really reconsider what you think you know. In light of the things that are coming to light, what is it of Canadian history that you know to actually be true? And I challenge and encourage people on this day to not only give this thought and consideration, but to take some steps to educate yourself. And it's not hard to do. When I first started doing this research back in 2000, it was a slog. This was, you had to be in the dusty archives and in the library stacks and, looking for materials that were very difficult to find. They're not difficult to find now. And in fact, you could probably find everything that I have referred to today, you could find with one Google search. And so I really encourage that. If you take nothing else from this day, I hope that you will take that. So we really didn't talk about the order of things prior to this event. So I'm not sure where you would like to go next.
Well, perhaps we could then start with some Q&A. Let me see what there's a chapter, we'll refer to your book now, which I know you didn't really speak about directly in your talk there, but there's a chapter in the book that involves one of the characters trying to cross the border from the US into Canada without being bothered by a border agent. The character knows to look for a dirt road and certain signage that marks where to safely drive into Canada towards a reserve. Were these real safe spots or back trails based on real accounts on how to safely cross the border without being hassled? That was a question from Julia.
That was a question from Julia. Well, I did talk about the book and why I wrote the book and what I hope it would achieve, but just not in the gory details. When we talk about borders, it's really interesting because borders are imaginary lines that people agree on, and they change all the time. It's really fun to go back and take a look at a world map from, 1850 or something, and you'll see that all the lines are different, right? Because the way people were imagining the boundaries of country was very different. And so, in particular with Indigenous people, those boundaries are really weird because they cut right through Indigenous nations. There are many nations that are just split right by the Canadian American so-called border. And so there was a provision in a treaty. It was called the Jay Treaty, and that treaty allowed for the unimpeded access back and forth across the border of Indigenous peoples on either side. Well, actually, the Americans never accepted it, but the Canadians did. That we could cross the border at any time because that was our community, right? And we pre-existed the border, and our territory pre-existed the border. So it would have been a part of our history that there were these places that we crossed through different parts of North America versus Canada or the US. For a good example of this is the Blackfoot in southern Alberta. That's actually the Blackfoot or Blackfeet Nation, as they call themselves in the US. But in Montana and Alberta, it's all one community that is split by the border. So yeah, those crossing areas are real, and they weren't established to cross the border without having to deal with border guards. Although that's why she used it in the story. They were just the way we went from A to B before anybody got here.
Thank you. Going back to your book, who inspired the 5 central characters? That's a question from Anonymous.
Well, hi, Anonymous. How are you today? I'm not so anonymous today. It's kind of interesting because I get this a lot. People are wondering, who I base the characters on. And I didn't really base them on anybody. The characters really are archetypes. I started writing the book when I started the master's program, the Masters of Fine Arts program. And the first chapter that I wrote was about Kenny, who I have such a soft spot for. And I immediately knew that if I was going to articulate the full breadth of experience that these kids had at residential school, that I would need more characters. So what I did was I looked at the kinds of abuses that kids experienced at the schools. And then I looked at, like, I've read hundreds of psychological assessments in the course of my work. And so I looked at the kinds of impacts, the kinds of psychological injury that are likely to arise from those kinds of abuses. And then from there, I asked myself, now, what is the trajectory of this person's life going to look like, living with not only the experience of the abuse, but the impact of it over time? And so that was how I developed my characters. And, you know, people ask me if I, you know, base it on real people, or if, you know, it is based on real people and so on. And, you know, this isn't something, the impact of abuse at res schools was not something I had to research. That's been my whole life, in terms of my mother's experiences, in terms of when I first started working with Indigenous organizations, I was only 18 years old. And virtually everybody that I was working with was a survivor. You know, had either just been released or had just escaped, or, but my entire cohort was residential school survivors. So this was the life that I was immersed in, not something that I had to seek out and learn and try to understand. It was my world. And so yeah, that's how I developed the characters.
Thank you. Now, may I ask, how did you get into that work of working with residential school survivors?
Well, you know, it's interesting, but I mean, in my legal career, that's a different answer. But if you are working with any Indigenous community in the 70s and 80s, you're working with survivors, right? And you're seeing firsthand how the impact of those schools impact the community as well as the individual. And there's a couple of references to this in the book, when Kenny tries to go home and when Maisie tries to go home, and how they just don't belong there anymore. And you know, I think I said it earlier, or I may have said it in my previous event, that we didn't just experience this individually, we experienced it collectively. And when we talk about intergenerational harm, people often immediately turn to the idea of the children of survivors. But even before that, on the day that those children were taken away from their communities, their mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunties, uncles, all of them were impacted immediately, because it was the role of the adults in those communities to educate the children, to help them to understand and assume their role in the community, to be responsible for the rearing of these children, and that was taken away from them. So their roles, you know, as I say, were taken away, and the fabric of the community began to fray as a result of that, because their whole purpose for being alive was taken away and carted off to an institution. And so everybody in a community, you know, even if I wasn't specifically working with survivors, if I was working in an Indigenous community, I was working with survivors and the impacts of the schools. And so that's all something that that informed my experience and informed my sense of how far-reaching the harm and the damage is.
Thank you. And I just want to remind our viewers, if you have a question, you can submit it to the chat box or text them to 780-838-3925. And you talked about earlier the misconception that perhaps residential schools, the system was well-intentioned. But what else do you think is the biggest misconception or most understood about residential schools in Canada?
The most understood or misunderstood?
Misunderstood.
Well, the whole thing. I mean, people tend to think that it's, ancient history, that it's a long, long time ago, when in fact the last school closed in 1996. And that's an interesting story as well, because, the schools didn't start closing because, people decided this was a terrible thing. They actually started closing in 1969. And what that was about was that the employees of the residential schools wanted to be treated in the same way that other federal civil servants were treated. They wanted to have pensions and, union representation and, benefits and all of those things that other federal employees get. And the federal government didn't want to pay for it. So they said, okay, we're going to start devolving the residential school system. And that was when you see the commencement of the 60s scoop, where the child welfare system basically took over where the residential schools left off. And but I think that I think the majority of Canadians just had no clue whatever. I think that they misunderstood the entire history of what happened there, and and think of it in the way that they've been taught to think about it, if it was ever even discussed at all. And the way that Canadians have been taught to think about this through their politicians, through what little there is in school curriculum, is again that it was this well-intentioned thing for the poor Indian child. And which is just a terrible, terrible misrepresentation of history.
Thank you. Just a comment from Anonymous. They say, I love how your book was about the life of the survivors after school. We often forget the stories of survival after school. Thank you for the beautifully written story of these characters. I cannot put the book down.
Aw, thank you. Well, and that was my whole point, right? There is a lot of work that has been done over the years about what it was like in the schools, what was done in the schools, the purpose of the schools, and whether it's in memoir or fiction or academic work and so on. There's quite a bit of that work, but there was almost nothing about the impacts of this on the long term and what happened when these kids were able to leave the school, and how critical that was, both for the individual kids and for the communities, the losses that they experienced on both levels. So that was part of the plan right from the outset. This is about the impacts. This is about what happens next.
Thank you. And I agree, as a reader, I think you really bridged a gap of, some understanding of what happened in residential school, and then the intergenerational trauma. You really bridged the gap of what happened kind of in between there. Another question from Anonymous. Anonymous is busy today. How can we move beyond one single day of potential or perceived orange washing and into meaningful truth and reconciliation acts within organization and businesses?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe there's more than one Anonymous. It's a really, really good question, because, it's really easy for an event such as this to become performative in nature. It's like Trudeau and his photo opportunity on the reserve in Saskatchewan after they, identified the grave sites there. I mean, they're always ready for the photo op and to, cry the crocodile tears and say, oh yes, every child matters. But, just yesterday, and I'm pardon me while I digress, but just yesterday, the Federal Court of Canada threw out the government's action where they were trying to uphold their treatment of Indigenous children in care, which the Canadian Human Rights Commission had already found to be discriminatory, and that they were paying foster parents of Indigenous children basically half of what they were paying foster parents of non-Indigenous children. And so, you know, I mean, so he can have his crocodile tears and his photo opportunity, and you know, him and what's her name, the, you know, whatever, the Jane, whatever, not Jane, the other one, anyway. You know, they can sing the song of every child matters, but their actions are what counts. And they've been fighting Cindy Blackstock in court for, gosh, almost 20 years now. And that's just simply inexcusable. But as I say, I digress a little bit because I'm so happy about that decision. But, you know, the primary prerequisite to reconciliation, to meaningful reconciliation, is truth. And I think that Canadians got a solid dose of some pretty brutal truth today, or not today, but this year, with the identification of these grave sites. And I think it has inspired Canadians to try to understand the real truth. And once that happens, then we can't be stopped, because we will jointly be seeking meaningful reconciliation. But one of the other things that's critical is that we, I'm sorry, the technical person, do I have to see your video? I can see you. Sorry, it's just a little distracting. So anyway, so one of the things that's very critical for meaningful reconciliation is for the Indigenous people of this land to be able to share in the economy of this land, to meaningfully share in the resources of this country, so that we can once again become self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and self-determining. The Constitution of this country and the common law acknowledges Aboriginal rights and the right to Aboriginal title. And now we have to see how we have to find a way to implement that in a way that we're not beggars in our own land. There can be no reconciliation unless it involves some manifestation of giving the land back and the resources therein. That has to happen. It's taken us this long to get to a point where the government will admit what residential schools were. It has to go much faster, or this is just not going to happen. But that was the understanding of treaties in particular, and agreements with people in terms of peoples that lived in unceded lands, was that our mode of life would be able to continue, and that, of course, has not been the case. So, we need to see the, and I mean, these words start to lose their meaning, but we need to see decolonization of institutions that are founded in colonial principles. And that includes our government departments. It includes the way legislation is crafted. It includes the RCMP, for heaven's sakes, who are founded on the Northwest Mounted Police, who were a paramilitary force designed to get rid of us. And so we need to scrub all of that colonial intention out of our law and policy and governing structure, and to give it a chance that the social fabric can heal in a manner that reflects a relationship between equals, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians.
In this question, very similar, but perhaps you might have more to add. It's been 6 years since the TRC's calls to action. What are your thoughts on the progress or lack of progress since that time?
Well, there's an excellent report that has been prepared by the Yellowhead Institute on the progress of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. there are only 6 that have been completed out of 96. This makes the 7th the recognition of a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. You know, out of 96, I'd say that's a pretty poor report card. And what's really interesting is when you read the report, if you so choose, and it's easy to find, it's Yellowhead Institute Truth and Reconciliation in your Google search bar, and you'll find it. What's very interesting about it is that the calls to action that have been implemented are one-offs. There's like where it just takes one action to do it. Like, for example, you know, recognizing this day for funding the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry. Those, you know, more funding for the arts for Indigenous people, those kinds of things that are all very important things, but they are not things that focus their attention on the systemic racism in our Canadian institutions. They don't address the question of, you know, why it is that Indigenous people are #1 in suicide, in poverty, in addictions, in incarceration, in the murder of women and girls. It doesn't address the foundations of those social crises that we are living and continue to live. And so it's only when, you know, it's only when those systemic issues are addressed that reconciliation will even be possible. And so that's what I'm hoping that our advocacy will continue to support, is this more meaningful approach to changing the dynamics of Canadian society to reflect the principles of those calls to action.
Thank you. Now just a comment from Janet. Thank you so much for speaking today and for writing your novel. It really opened my eyes to what has and what is still happening. Appalling doesn't even begin to describe it. The churches and government have a lot to atone for. We all need to learn about this, and only by reading and listening can we begin to understand. Thank you.
This is absolutely true. And I cannot stress enough that there is so much out there now. Like no time in history ever. There are so many resources available to teach people about this, you know, from the littlest child to the oldest adult. There is, you know, age-appropriate material available to people, and I just really encourage everybody to pass it on, you know, to really encourage your friends and family to embark on this journey as well.
And now another anonymous question. In the book, the characters attend residential school and it follows what path their lives took once they left school. The same thing is now happening with the child welfare system. This isn't so much a question, but I'm interested in your thoughts and how you see what you wrote about it in your book continuing to unfold in relation to the child welfare system.
Well, as I was saying earlier in my response to something, you know, is that when they closed down the residential schools, the child welfare system took over, and it you know, there are factual articulations of the intent, you know, the federal support of the wholesale apprehension of Indigenous kids, and, you know, selling them off, literally selling them, and they would often, these kids would often become the workhorse of a family, where they would be treated as less than, and, you know, they would only be there to work as a domestic slave, a domestic servant. And so I don't see any sort of break between the residential school legacy and, you know, and the child welfare system picking up where it left off. I don't think that they're different in any way. I think they are founded on the same principle and the same desires to, you know, terminate Indigenous communities and to, you know, to render us just completely powerless in our own land. I don't know if people are aware of the system of birth alerts. Birth alerts were, well, some places, they still exist, and I think it was only this year that they were ended in Manitoba, was anytime an Indigenous woman gave birth, within an hour, a social worker would be at her bedside grilling her about her fitness as a mother. This happened not just before Manitoba stopped doing it. It happened to a woman who I know, who is a PhD and a professor, and went into hospital to have her baby and was, basically threatened with the apprehension of her child. And, I mean, can you imagine, can any of the mothers in the audience today imagine an hour after giving birth and someone is there with the explicit intent of taking your child? I reflected that experience with Lucy in the book when she gives birth, and the social worker comes, and Clara helps her escape before she comes back. But this went on, and not only this, women, Indigenous women, were also subjected to sterilization procedures without their consent on a wholesale basis, where they would go and have a baby, and then they would, maybe a year or something later, go to their doctor and say, I've been trying to, have another child, and I'm not having any luck. And the doctor says, oh, well, you had a tubal ligation when you had your last child. And it's news to the woman. It's news. And they say, oh, well, you signed for it. And it's just doctors or whatever saying, sign here, do as you're told, right? And so, so, the assault on Indigenous women and children, it has just been unending. And I hope things are changing now, but what a challenge, what a challenge.
Thank you. This is a question from Martin. He says, congratulations on Five Little Indians being optioned as a television series. You've authored various forms of literature, such as poetry, short stories, longer narrative, and worked previously on television productions too. Could you comment on the role that the arts, be it literature, film, television, other visual arts, play in reconciliation? Thanks in advance.
Oh, it's absolutely critical, and one of the reasons that I'm so hopeful and excited about, maybe getting a limited series of the book is not everybody reads. My son suffered terribly from dyslexia. He's a brilliant guy. But, dyslexia really laid him low in terms of reading, and he had to find alternative ways of absorbing information, which he did, of course. And so, the arts and the expression of art in all different mediums is very important, because it opens the doors between worlds. And in many ways, I feel like it does it in a less confrontational and a more I want to say visceral, but it's not what I mean. Just through beauty and senses, through what we hear, what we see, in the arts. And I really think that the arts have already played a critical role in creating understanding. I mean, even if you look at the totem poles that were carved, the reconciliation pole that was carved up at the UBC School of Anthropology and or Museum of Anthropology, sorry. And the role that has played in educating every single person that walks through that museum, and it's really a museum of living history, not of ancient history. And so, yeah, I am a strong supporter of the arts in every way, and the arts as a tool for cross-cultural communication.
Similar question, question of similar nature. Your book was very powerful for me and opened my eyes to what happened to students once they left residential schools. What would be your top book recommendations for people looking to continue their learning on truth and reconciliation?
Well, I'll do better than that. David Robertson is an Indigenous author, and he curated a list of 48 books about residential schools that cross all genres and age groups, and it is a fabulous list. And I will email it to the organizers, who presumably will be able to post it somewhere, and you can find it. And it's just a wonderful, really, really wonderful list that, you know, starting with picture books for little kids and going right through to very complex academic narratives. So I'll send that on.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing that list. Another kind of similar question from Julia. Are there a few resources that were key in writing your book?
You know, I said it a bit earlier, I didn't have to study to do this. I didn't have to research to do this. This was my life. And, you know, even the backdrop of the downtown east side in Vancouver as the main geographical backdrop for the book, I spent my teen years in foster care in Vancouver, and was aging out right about the time that these kids were aging out of the foster school or residential school in the book. And so, you know, the memory of what the city was like, the memory of what the challenges of being Indigenous in the city were like, those are very fresh in my mind. And you know, all of this comes from my lived experience, whether it's my mom and other relations, or people that I worked with, or my own experience. It's really all from lived experience. You're muted, darling.
Doing so well with that. Thank you. Question from Sarah. There are almost 20 calls to action for the justice system, and not one has been completed. Do you have any comments on how individuals can demand from our local RCMP stations or court systems?
This, I think, is probably one of the most challenging areas, because law is, you know, they call it a justice system, but it isn't about justice. It's about, and I say this to people often, you know, that the justice system is really just about a collection of rules that certain people have agreed to, and then some punishments if you don't abide by those rules. It's not about the higher principle of justice. And that's why justice escapes us when we look at the legal system. I'll call it legal system versus a justice system. You know, and I mean, there have been some teeny tiny little improvements, and they may not have been, you know, as those articulated in the calls to action, but there are many communities who have now developed Indigenous courts that avail themselves of elders and Indigenous law, not Aboriginal law, not the common law created by Canada, but Indigenous law and belief. That, I think, is a tremendous opportunity, not only for Indigenous people to get a fair shake, but also for the non-Indigenous judiciary, the judges and legal practitioners, to participate in these courts and to see another way of doing things, a way of doing things that is probably more effective. But the real struggle is that you can't expect reconciliation without change, without fundamental change. And I think that, you know, the institutions are not committed to that, you know, bones deep kind of change. They're not committed to that. They're committed to appeasing Indigenous people, which they haven't done that either, but not to tearing it down and rebuilding. And that's really what has to happen, because all of our legal institutions, you know, flow from the British legal institutions and are based on colonial principles. So how can there be justice for Indigenous people in a system that's based on colonial principles? There can't be. It has to be recreated. And I don't know how to make that happen. If I did, I would. But we just have to just keep working away at it, just keep chipping away at it. And, you know, one of the other things that has happened, which is a good thing, is the end of, and I don't know if there's any lawyers in the crowd, but it's the end of peremptory challenges. And what peremptory challenges are, they don't exist anymore in Canada, where defense counsel or the Crown, in criminal matters, they could exempt a juror for no reason. They could just say, I don't want that person on the jury panel. And this happened, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the murder of Colton Boushie. Colton was from my reserve. That's my reserve, Red Pheasant, and he was my relation. And at his trial, there was not, at the trial of the man that murdered him, there was not, and this was a point blank bullet to the head, okay? There was not a single Indigenous juror on the jury panel, and that was because of this matter of peremptory challenges, where he could just, you know, an Indigenous potential juror would stand up, he'd say, nope, don't want that person. So we end up with an all-white jury, not unlike the all-white juries in the trials of Black people in the South. And so that changed as a result of the, he was not convicted. That man who murdered Colton was not convicted. He was not convicted of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. The only thing he was convicted of was unsafe storage of a firearm. And so, as horrible as that is, I am thankful that out of that, Indigenous people can't be shut out of juries anymore by the use or the improper use of peremptory challenges. So that's one change. And, you know, and I also don't want to sound so pessimistic about things. You know, I've been around long enough. I've been around since I was 18 years old. I've been in this struggle. I'm 65 next week. And I have seen real meaningful change. I have. And therefore, I'm able to believe that even deeper, even more meaningful change is possible when the hearts and minds of everyday folk are committed to it. And that's my hope. That's my dream.
I hope many of us share that dream. And on that note, what does, you know, true reconciliation look like to you?
Land back. You know, what it looks like to me, and I mean, I look at reconciliation kind of from the bookkeeping perspective. And, you know, maybe people don't do this anymore, I don't know, but you get your paper or your, you know, online bank statement, and it says this is your balance, right? And then you have to reconcile the statement to the balance, okay? And that's what we need to do, okay? And right now it's kind of like this, and we need to get it back to this, right? Where the access to resources, to services, to the quality of life that non-Indigenous Canadians enjoy, that, you know, we should have those kinds of resources to support a comparable life. And, you know, I've thought about this so much over the years, and things like recognizing another order of government, Indigenous governments, in terms of, you know, equalization payments from the federal government, similar to the equalization payments that are paid out to the provinces, where the wealthier provinces, you know, everybody puts in their dough, and then they equalize so that the less lucrative or the less financially well-off provinces benefit from this. You know, something like that, something where there is acknowledgement that the tremendous profit that is generated from the resources of this land should be shared with us, because really they're ours. If anybody can own them, we do.
Thank you for that. And we have time for a few more questions. We've got one from Anonymous. Why use the word Indian in the title?
Because when this book, well, first of all, a couple of things. We're all Indians. You can call us whatever you want, but legally, we're Indians. The Indian Act defines us that way. And you know, the protection of our status, or the recognition of our distinct status, and the protection of our lands was articulated first in the first iteration of the Canadian Constitution, which was the British North America Act. I've forgotten the sections, section 92(1) states that the federal government will be responsible for Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. It was only in the mid to late 1970s that non-Indigenous Canada began referring to us as natives. And then after that, into the 80s, we started being termed Aboriginal. And now we're, you know, being called Indigenous and so on. And so I used the word Indian in the title for two specific reasons. A, because it was time appropriate for the time that we enter into the book. But more importantly, B, I wanted anybody that took a look at that book cover to know that this was going to be about a profound racism that continues to be perpetrated in this country of ours. And so, and then of course, you know, they were my 5 little Indians, my characters who became in many ways like my children.
And yeah, interesting. I wondered that myself, especially when we talk about language, and you're a writer, so of course everything you say and write is very intentional. Paige has a question. What is your perspective on allyship?
Well, it's really interesting because when, you know, as you may have noticed, I kind of prefer a roundabout answer approach. But when Dr. Bryce, who I referred to earlier in our presentation today, wrote his article, A National Crime for the Ottawa Citizen, he referred to Indigenous people as our allies. And it wasn't sort of the modern day woke notion of being an ally. What it was is that when the wars were fought between the French, the English, and the Americas, it was the Indigenous allies that that supported the outcome that we continue to benefit from today, that non-Indigenous Canada continues to benefit from today. And that is how I see the term ally, okay, is like there is a treaty between us, and I'm not talking about the numbered treaties, but there is a treaty between us that we are going to support each other, and that we are going to recognize a shared goal, a shared desired outcome, and we are going to work, we are going to dedicate ourselves to achieving that shared outcome, which way back then was the way North America would ultimately be demarcated as between the two nations of the States and Canada. And so I think we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion of ally as being, you know, a cool, sensitive, supportive person. And I think we need to think of it in that far more international way, if you will, that we are here to join together in a common endeavor, not as one, you know, not as one party with more power and so on, you know, to benevolently reach down to the poor Indian, pardon me, and say, oh, let me help you. It's not that. It's about two peoples and a shared objective, and a meaningful commitment to each other to walk the same road.
That was really, really beautiful. Thank you, Michelle. Jennifer has a question. She says, I was really captivated by this book, the characters and their experiences. Can we look forward to another novel from you in the future?
Yes, as a matter of fact, you can. In the fall of 2023, if I can ever get it written, I'm working on a second novel that is also historical fiction. This one is based on the time starting around 1856 in what was then the Northwest Territories, which was, you know, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, parts of the Dakotas, and it covers, or the main character, there's two main characters. I gave myself a break this time, not five. It's so much work. One of the main characters is loosely based on my great-grandmother, who was born in 1856 and never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was maybe even as old as 20. And so in that character, you have a pre-contact Cree woman who is living a traditional lifestyle. And then we have impact. And then it follows her life through that very, very volatile time in the, you know, right around 1875 on into the early 1900s, when we were being, you know, harassed and people were trying to force us off our lands. And then it also brings in the story of a character based on my mother and her relationship with my great-grandmother, and how my great-grandmother's experiences influenced how she advised her granddaughter, and how that in turn influenced the choices that the character based on my mother makes. And what I hope to be able to illuminate is how Indigenous women in Canada came to be disposable, how it became okay to kill, abuse, brutalize Indigenous women, because there is a historical record and a trail, if you will, about how that came to be, and the complicity of government and other agencies in that brutalization of Indigenous women. So that's it. That's what I'm working on.
And this is might be relevant to that. Margaret says, thank you for sharing your time with us today. I'm wondering, I can see the beaded orange t-shirt, but I can't make out the second pin. Is it a red dress for missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Here. Can you see it better? Yes, that's exactly what it is. A friend of mine made these for me. It was so lovely. And it is. And I think these two, if we can stop compartmentalizing these, right, and, you know, acknowledge that they, you know, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, the residential school legacy, it's all part of a whole. And that whole is the colonial impact on Indigenous people.
Time now for just a couple more questions. Anonymous says, have you seen or what is your book's role in advancing reconciliation?
Telling the damn truth. And giving people, you know, what I hope is a non-judgmental, you know, just an opportunity, a non-judgmental opportunity to walk in the reality of that world, to try it on for size, see how it feels, and see what it inspires you to think and do.
Well, we definitely thank you for providing that experience for us in such a touching and, yes, uncomfortable way, but I guess reconciliation is not meant to be comfortable. I just want to let all our listeners know we do have the resource that Michelle mentioned, the 48 books by Indigenous writers. Read it's in the chat. We'll be sure to share it elsewhere as well. And I just want to end on a comment. This is from Tracy Burt. The journey of survivors in the book was so real and raw, the different paths they took in the book, the hardships, the life lessons. This book made me laugh, cry, and brought out anger too. I love this book. Thank you, Auntie.
Oh, this is the beautiful Tracy Burt, who is the daughter of my cousin Colleen. I'm so glad you're there, Tracy, and thank you for that.
I hope, yeah, I just wanted to end on a familiar note, because
yeah,
that brings you some comfort. Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your time with us today. It's a really important day. I can't imagine what your calendars look like this week. So thank you. We appreciate you spending some time with us. And if you haven't read Michelle's book, please do. You can find it wherever you buy books. I mentioned this to Michelle earlier, and I warn everyone, if you're going to read it, give yourself some time, because I couldn't put it down. It's heartbreaking. It's difficult to read, but it's a necessary read. And please continue to join us on this journey of reconciliation in Wood Buffalo. Michelle gave us a lot to think about today in terms of what we can all do, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, resources to read. There's a lot to take home with us, because today is just one step of the journey into reconciliation. We've got a lot of work left to do. You can learn more about what the regional municipality Wood Buffalo is doing at www.rmwb.ca/TRC, and stay tuned for more speakers in our Indigenous speaker series. Thank you again, Michelle, for sharing your story with us. And I don't know if you have anything else you want to add today before we wrap up.
Yes, don't be afraid to read my book. You know, as Tracy said, there's a lot of humor in it, and there's just so much love in it. And there's hope, and there's, you know, just a real, I've tried to, you know, have, you know, a real hope for the future in this book. It's not all bitter or painful. So don't be afraid of my book. And thank you for having me. I do really appreciate the opportunity to have these conversations. I learn from them. I learn to think about things from a different perspective sometimes, and I just really enjoy the opportunity. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you again, Michelle. And thank you to everyone who took the time intentionally today to join us in this event. And I hope you commit to learning more and doing your part in reconciliation. This includes our time together. Until next time, thank you, Marcy Cho, and hi.
See you later, everybody.